But thanks, everyone. It's great to see so many people here for this event that's hosted by the Emergent Nonfiction Lab at the University of Salford. My name is Patrick Brian Smith. I'm an assistant professor and university fellow in the School of Arts, Media and Creative Technology at the University of Salford. So it gives me great pleasure today to welcome Matthew Ford and Miglė Bareikytė for this talk on Matthew's new book. So Matthew Ford is an academic focusing on war and the data-saturated battlefields of the 21st century. His previous book, Radical War, with Professor Andrew Hoskins from Edinburgh University, traces war's data trajectories from the epicenters of battle out to distant parts of the world, into history, memory, and as it is memed into the platforms that mediate digital culture. Matthew's first book, Weapon of Choice, Small Arms and the Culture of Military Innovation, is an analysis of military innovation and culture. Matthew is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in the UK, an associate of the IWM Institute, a senior non-resident fellow at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida, an honorary historical consultant to the Royal Armouries in the UK, a former visiting scholar at the Defence Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, a former West Point Fellow, and the founding editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Military History. And our respondent today, and I'll introduce you now, Miglė, if that's okay, is Miglė Bareikytė. She holds the chair of digital studies at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, where she's a dual member of the Faculty of Social and Cultural Sciences and the European New School of Digital Studies. She has been researching digitalization for many years with a special focus on Central and Eastern Europe. Since 2022, she's been leading the CRC 1187 project, War Sensing, which involves investigating civilian media and data practices, digital war, witnessing on Telegram Messenger, and AI imaginaries during Russia's war against Ukraine, in collaboration with colleagues from the University of Siegen, the Center for Urban History in Lviv, and the University of Bern and beyond. In addition, Bareikytė's research extends to the study of historical and contemporary disinformation practices and conflicts in platform economies. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Matthew initially, and then we'll hear from him for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have a response from Miglė for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to broader questions. So yeah, Matthew, it'd be great to hear more about war in the smartphone age. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much. And Miglė, thanks for agreeing to talk about the book with me. It's great to be here and to chat to folks. There's one other thing I wanted to do, and that's partly because I'm trawling for articles. I'm an associate editor and books, actually. I'm an associate editor for the European Journal of International Security. So if you've got a sort of security-related article that you want to get published, please consider EJIS. And I've just recently taken on a role as a book series editor for a new series that Hurst and Co. putting together called Technology Data War, which is, I've published 3 books with Hurst, and I like them a lot. I wouldn't think about becoming a book series editor with them unless I thought they were a great place. At the moment, they have a relationship with OUP in the US. I don't know whether how long that will continue, but at the moment, you can also get your work published with OUP, which is let's just see good. I'm just trying to make sure that technology works, which gives me an opportunity to flog books at you, which I can't help but do, which is why I've got a QR code so you can all get your smartphones out and do a quick search for me as on the Amazon author list. I think it's important. I put this slide up just to sort of position war in the smartphone age as in the context of the other things I've done. My first book was really about how organizations, how the armed forces think about innovation and change in an analog sense. I mean, you can't get anything more analog than guns. And of course, you're an idiot for doing a a PhD on guns. That was my PhD, but the book isn't quite my PhD. But they're very simple technologies. There's only 120 components in them, and you can really do a lot to trace how organizations, the armed forces, and others think about and imagine war and prepare for war using these very simple technologies. And the reason why I bring it up is partly because it seems to me that the armed forces generally are still thinking in those sorts of terms. You know, their organizations and bureaucracies are still structured in bureaucratic terms that take for granted that this analog framing for technology change. And of course, what we've seen over the last 20 years, but very much over the last 5 to 10 years, is just how much things are changing in the context of digital life. So my second book with Andrew, Radical War, was really an attempt to try and figure out how media and war studies might come into conversation with each other. And in that respect, we mapped the relationship in terms of data, attention, and control. For me, that book was very much about thinking about representations of war and then reflecting how that might also shape the conduct of war. And it came out, actually, if I think about it, in March 2022, just a few weeks after Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I gave a talk we gave a talk to the US Marine Corps on a podcast. And there was nothing like trying to sort of sketch out what we thought was going on in radical war terms in front of a bunch of hairy-ass Marines, and trying to make sure that we knew enough about what was going on in Ukraine to sort of establish whether radical war had any legs. So really, War in a Smartphone Age is born out of me trying to understand how wrong radical war was, with a view to seeing to testing really the hypothesis that Andrew and I had set out. And I think it's fair to say, I'd like to think, and I leave it to you folks who might read the book to tell me what you think. But for me, at least, Radical War, I think, was on the money in terms of a lot that was going on in terms of digital and in media and war studies. War in a Smartphone Age is me trying to sketch out how I think about it in the last 3 years, really. And it occurred to me that if I don't actually write this stuff down and document it all properly, then I'm gonna miss an opportunity to write a book and to sell one. So which is where War in a Smartphone Age comes from. And in particular, one of the things I was keen to do was to try and draw out how digital media is shaping not just how wars are represented, but more fundamentally, for me, someone who's got a background in war studies, how digital media was shaping the conduct of war. So that's really the focus, really, for War in a Smartphone Age. So I start in War in a Smartphone Age with this quote from Hassan Nasrallah, where he observes that Israel has completely and fundamentally got the whole of Hezbollah under surveillance, and as a result, he's blaming people's use of smartphones. You know, the smartphone is the window on people's lives, and of course, everyday use of the smartphone is such that it helps surveillance capitalists figure out how to sell you things. But equally, it's the same technologies, the GPS, the cookies on your your use of browser, your use of your phone and your social media and all the other bits, the microphone, the camera, and all the rest, all the accelerometer and all the rest of it. You know, it's a huge amount of surveillance data. And of course, we are actively participating in our own surveillance. We're doing that principally because we get so many benefits from allowing our profiles to be online. Of course, that same technology is precisely what the Israeli intelligence community were taking advantage of when it came to trying to understand the structure of Hezbollah's leadership. And Nasrallah, for understandable reasons, is saying, get off your smartphones, go to a lesser technology. For me, the interesting thing here is not that I mean, the interesting thing really is that even when you try to get off the grid, right, you're still on the grid, right? And in that respect, there may be uneven distributions of technologies and uneven distributions of how people choose to get online or whatever, but there's still a footprint. And that footprint can be used from an intelligence perspective for the purposes of targeting, identifying people, and all the rest of it. So that's why, and it seems to me that we're self-evidently in this kind of moment where mundane technologies, they have become mundane, these very sophisticated supercomputers that we carry in our hands, which the vast majority of the world have become mundane, and we've forgotten how significant they are in shaping both how we live, but also how we live under conditions of war. And that's really where War in a Smartphone Age sort of starts to jump in. So I'm going to try and quickly skip through these bullet points, and I'm going to end up with some stuff on participative war, which I've been working on with Grigory Asiimov at King's. That's I'm partly doing that because otherwise I give the same talk every time and I get increasingly more bored. So I don't want to bore myself, and I'm hoping that my enthusiasm for my own subject will come through as a result of me talking about some of this stuff that I've been working on with Gregory. And I'm actually open if people have questions or things that they want to throw in to answering those as we go. So if you've got a hold on, what did he just say? I don't understand, or that sounds like nonsense. Just get stuck in. So the obvious starting place is to think about, and for media studies scholars, this is kind of maybe too noddy, but it's worth repeating, which is that we've got, in terms of representation in war, we've gone from something that I remember well. My grey beard gives it away that I was alive at the time. I remember well in terms of the Gulf War, first Gulf War in 1990-91, and this is sort of very top-down media, highly editorialized approach to delivering news. And of course, we've moved from there to something like this, where we've got smartphones driving the drones that make it possible to record the images on the right-hand side, which can then be used both for the purposes of adjusting artillery and mortar fire onto adversaries, or for deciding when to drop a bomb, as you can see there, and for recording all of that, not just for the artillery and the military who are going about ordinary everyday military activities, but can also be used for propaganda purposes to amplify messages around social media. And there's, in many respects, no reason why you couldn't just broadcast directly from your social media directly onto the internet, and then you'd have a live feed, as it were, of all of this that's going on. There's all sorts of military reasons why you don't want to do that, but the technology, it seems to me, is increasingly there to effectively very much reduce the gap between what might be called war and media. So that, I mean, and this of course is an old story but one where it seems to me the smartphone embodies some of those changes. It's sort of a material representation of some of those changes that are going on, and we can carry that around in our hands. And the important thing, I mean, this is a particularly nasty tweet, but the important thing to look at is the date stamp at the bottom left-hand corner of each tweet. 12:45, October 10th, 23, 2.6 million views. No time difference whatsoever, and you've got 4.6 million views. So what we're talking about is the transmission of this stuff at a speed and scale that is really way beyond what has ever been possible. So there may have always been situations where civilians have been recording things or reporting things or telling people things, but they've been doing it on a one-to-one media basis, or maybe one-to-many over a radio. But when we're talking about 4.6 million views in a millisecond, I would put it to you that we understanding the politics and the military implications, the political and the military implications of this, we haven't quite worked out how to work our way around this set of challenges yet. So speed and scale is different. And that points, well, I've been trying to point out how we should be thinking about how bringing media studies and war studies into closer relationship. And I've tried to do that in War and Smartphone Age by thinking about things, by putting things in terms of targeting and participation. So from a war studies point of view, you've got the military activity of finding, fixing, finishing, exploiting, and analyzing. This is a targeting cycle. This is how you find the enemy, and then this is how you figure out, deploy various bits of ordnance to attack, and then look for the battle damage assessment, go and get some information about how successful you've been, analyze that, and then put it back into your targeting cycle. From a civilian point of view, the smartphone has sort of created the conditions in which you can produce, publish, and consume media all from one device. And that has all sorts of implications, which some of you, I'm sure, will be very aware of in terms of the relationship between mainstream media and social media. Now, the idea that these two, targeting and representation, have collapsed into one is most obviously signified through the Ivorog app in Ukraine, which I learnt about in March 22, which is the point at which I realized that Radical War really was onto something. What you see on that image on the right-hand side is a Russian soldier pointing their assault rifle, at someone recording the movement of the Russian column as it's going through someone's town in Ukraine. And actually, you hear gunshots on the video, and that just made me realize just how involved civilians were in the process, not just of telling the story about war, but also had effectively become combatants in war. The Russians couldn't tell whether the information that was being provided there was slotting into a targeting cycle, or whether they were just, this is astonishing. There's a Russian column moving down the street. We're going to record this because how many times do you see that happening? Now, in the laws of armed conflict terms, we've always had this notion of a blurring of civilian or non-combatant and combatant. We've always had that kind of blurring since the laws of armed conflict were, put out. Who's a legitimate target, what's legal and what's not. But what the suggestion I would like to make to you is that the smartphone effectively has become a embodiment of that dilemma. It's a physical representation of that again. So you've got this set of relationships that are coming together in and around the smartphone itself. Now, War and Smartphone Age isn't just about smartphones. It's the thing about this device is it sort of connects you to planetary scale computational capacity. If you've got ChatGPT on your phone, effectively you can access a remarkable set of AI technologies that are planetary in scale and nature. And that's all just from one device. So it's sort of, once you start reflecting on it, you realize that there are multiple layers as you're looking down through your phone into the technologies that make the phone possible, not just in hardware terms, but in software terms. And you're going really rather deep into sorts of infrastructures that make ordinary and everyday life possible in the 21st century. Now, Andrew and I make sense of that through this map, data retention control. Data, how data moves around, where it's created, how it moves, attention, how facts or not, information moves, information flows, how this shapes people's attention, and control the hardware, the infrastructure underneath it that makes it all possible. And War in the Smartphone Age spends a bit more time focused in on control, if you want, the infrastructures of some of these things that make data and attention possible. Of course, everyone has a smartphone. That creates all these conditions where we've got an enormous amount of data being produced, which makes it humanly impossible to make sense of what's going on. We need algorithmic interventions to start making sense of some of these things. And that has created the conditions in which you have a relationship between vertical mainstream media, where things are editorialized and messages are controlled, and participatory media, where things are horizontally distributed. And the messages are coming out of, organically or not sometimes, from people who are reporting the news themselves as they go about their everyday business. And I'm just going to skate through that. That creates the conditions in which you have a sense of churn and dysphoria. Top-down messages. This is an official message. These are the facts as reported by mainstream media, editorialized, fact-checked. This is the message as the government wants you to hear it. And then there's everyday people going out about their business who are sort of turning around going, well, hold on, that's not how we're reading things. And as this top-down and as this sort of top-down and participatory media environment meets each other, there's a sort of churning and uncertainty, and we kind of get disorientated in this sense of dysphoria. And in terms of how we make sense of what we're seeing around the place, we get this sort of splintering of realities. Now, the reason why I put this there is because my frustrations out of the war in Ukraine were we were suffering this ordinary splintering of reality, if you will, which a lot of people were discussing in relation to the moral panic around who owns what smartphone and what information can be presented to your kids and the rest of it. But then you had on top of it the challenges around understanding the fog of war and making sense of military stuff that was going on. And so for me, I really needed to slow it all down and try and make sense of how that was working. And my immediate jumping off point was to rely on open source intelligence. And I'm just going to skip over a couple of slides because I'm just looking at the time, and I don't want to spend all our time talking, and then you lot wishing you could get a question in. So here I kind of make reference to some stuff that Shashank Joshi is the defense editor of The Economist. He's passing comment on something that forensic architecture, there are open source intelligence organizations that you are all familiar with, forensic architecture, Bellingcat, Air Wars, others who are doing investigative work, trying to make sense of what they're seeing online. And in order to understand what was happening in Gaza in terms of the hospital attack, you needed to forensically go back onto the battlefield and actually check, where the tail fins of things and all the other bits and pieces to understand whether the Israelis had attacked the hospital in Gaza or whether it was a mistake by Hamas. But either way, you needed to do something forensic. But the problem was, of course, everyone was busy clearing up the attack before you could do that. So all you were left with was a sort of digital trail of what was going on, which was, of course, deeply contested, and there was a lack of clarity as to who did what. And I don't think we'll ever necessarily get to the bottom of it. But that points to some of the problems that mainstream media have in relation to online life, which is a function of who's first to the scoop, as it were. So, the problem for this attack on the hospital in Gaza hospital in October 23 was that a BBC journalist said it would probably been an Israeli attack. And that resulted in a week-long effort by lots of people online just to establish whether that was true or not. And of course, it came out that probably that wasn't the case. And then the BBC got in the net from the Israelis and everyone else was, being partisan and political. But John Byrne Murdoch here, who's a data journalist at the Financial Times, points out that actually mainstream media don't incorporate OSINT, open source intelligence techniques into a lot of the time into their news cycle, but they should. And that leads to Shashank's final point here around how we get inside what's going on the battlefield in methodological terms. And Rob Lee, who is an OSINT analyst, for want of a better word, is pointing out that actually academics and the journalists and all the others don't have necessarily the skills or the the understanding of appropriate method for trying to make sense of what they're seeing online. That's his claim, and that is repeated by Shashank here. So, this leads me to where I jumped in because, as I said, this sort of splintering reality, these splintering realities, a frustration about what social media life is like generally, and then in the context of war, led me to try and think, well, how the hell am I going to make sense of this, especially in the context of US Marines asking me questions about what's going on in the war. And inevitably, I turned to try to I turned to open source intelligence, I think, with a view to sort of trying to bottom out my understanding of what was going on in Ukraine. And so that led me to run an experiment with the Foreign Common Development Office and the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory to see whether analysts could work to the same standards as, ordinary people could work to the same standards as ICD 203, so the United States definition of what counts as an analytic standard, as it were, government level standards of intelligence work. And that resulted in us doing an experiment and showing that the analysts could do work at the same standard as a government intelligence organization. And that was really rather interesting because it implied that anyone could do this with the appropriate training or education or learning. And that's the suggestion there is that the tools are available to us, even though maybe not everyone understands how to read or make sense of what it is that they're being presented with. So we did 5 case studies looking at Russian logistics, the battle for Kiev, the river crossing of Bilorivka, the first battle of Kherson, and the overall build-up of Russian troops. And over a month, we built some analytic reports and then had a 3-day workshop with a whole bunch of people in the UK government, which was one of the hardest things I think I've ever done, because we were grilled on by various people to establish whether what we were doing was any good. But it was good fun. It was really good fun, and helped sort of make me realize just how throwaway some of the commentary was online when it comes to talking about war. The amount of effort that we had to go to sort of make ourselves feel comfortable that we could, we had suitable sources and methods to make appropriate analytic judgments, and the grilling that we got implied that, when you get a throwaway comment online, you have to be very careful about reading what that means, right, and making sense of that. Now, I put all of that out there because it seems to me that organizations like Hamas properly understand that relationship between mainstream media and participatory media. They understand, and the attack on October 7th was a remarkably sophisticated military operation. They recognize that they need to get Israelis themselves to broadcast their own murder, right? They don't need to put out their own propaganda when someone online with a smartphone is doing it for them. What they need to do is plan an operation such that they can maximize their opportunities to achieve political effect. And in that respect, the reason I bring up OSINT is because, of course, the planning for October 7th by Hamas was done exactly the same way that I went about with my colleagues for this experiment. The planning involved putting together an open source intelligence exercise to understand the distribution of Israeli infrastructure and where people were located, where Israeli armed forces were located, how to cross the various obstacles that they were going to be presented with, how to do that in such a way that they could maximize the political effect of Israelis themselves broadcasting their own murder. The challenge for them really was to create the opportunities where they could spread out all the way across southern Israel as far as they could. So the further they could get into southern Israel, the more atrocity and murder they could commit. And that effectively meant that they had to slow down the Israeli Defense Forces response time whilst giving the Israelis themselves the opportunity to spread their own images of death, right? So in that respect, it involved, from a Hamas point of view, the obvious thing to do was to attack Israeli military communications infrastructure so that effectively the Israelis would take too long to work out where the direction of the attack that Hamas were pursuing and all the rest of it, whilst leaving civilian telecommunications infrastructure up. So they all switched. There were 400 civilian SIM cards that on Israeli telecoms grid plugged into Hamas phones that allowed them to continue to communicate. But then the question was, do they knock out civilian communications infrastructure and allow that to so that no one could get advance warning and then spread out further, or leave that up so that Israelis could keep chatting with each other? And you can see the outcome of some of this in this Supernova Festival video. There was a documentary made, which brought together all of the. You can see how mediated war is by the fact that there is all this documentary evidence that was collated from smartphone footage and put together as a film that was broadcast on the BBC earlier last year, I think. That's where that implied to me that that Hamas really understood how to achieve maximum political effect with, this was smartphone participatory media directly shaping the conduct of war, what the targets were, who was going to be targeted, and how information was going to be exploited as part of that exercise. So the easiest bit was to get across the wall. The hardest bit, I'm just putting that slide back up, those red dots, that's where Hamas attacked IDF communications infrastructure, just military communications infrastructure, which then, once that was targeted and taken out, then they could spread out further. And you can see that in terms of that blue colouring shading there on the map, they could spread out further into southern Israel. That says to me that they had a good sense of what I've been, and it's not just me, there are other fantastic theorists, Benjamin Bratton, but there's a bunch of guys that I've been working with at Flinders University, Emily Bienvenue and Zach Rogers and Marianne Kelton, who've been talking about the digital anthropology of the stack. So we need to understand this space because this is the operating environment. It's about shaping information flows. Those information flows can be managed in terms of switched on and off through cyber engagement, but they can also be attacked kinetically, and any infrastructure inequalities can be exploited as well. And that all can be used to achieve political effect. Now, okay, so my claim, I suppose, at the heart of War and Smartphone Ages is that civilian and military communications infrastructure they're starting to become, they're overlapping. Military communications infrastructure is not as good as civilian communications infrastructure. So the military piggyback off civilian stuff in order to make it possible for them to keep working. And I'll show you a slide in a minute, which, brings that point out. But if these infrastructures are overlapping, then it implies, in my mind, and I think this is where Gregory Asmanov and I have been doing some work, it implies that actually civilians can do the work of the armed forces as much as the armed forces are, doing military targeting. And this is where I want to put it to you that there's the potential for an open kill chain, right, where civilians and their collection capabilities on their smartphones can fit into what I've described. I pulled out that targeting cycle that was a loop in my opening slides to find, fix, track, target, engage, assess. This is another loop where civilians can be involved in all of these things. So it starts with sponsor and develop. You can see in Ukraine, the Ministry for Digital Transformation is asking everyone out there to get involved and submit designs for drone technology, and they put it out online. They do online hackathons. There's all sorts of other things going on. It creates some conditions in which civil society can be more directly involved, and not just Ukrainian civil society, but anyone who might have something interesting to contribute and is willing to share with Ukraine's government can get involved in developing technology that might be used at some point down the line by the Ukrainian armed forces. You have an open source intelligence kill chain where you do the find, fix, and track and assess. And you can do it all online. You can see stuff online. You can track things online. You can effectively see images of things that have happened downline once they've been attacked to see whether they've been attacked or not. You can repurpose platforms that otherwise might not be used for intelligence work and make them suitable for crowdsourcing your intelligence analytical exercise. I haven't asked you all to go on signmyrocket.com, but if you did, you would be able to immediately participate directly in the war in Ukraine just by buying a rocket. They would then film the rocket being loaded onto a drone. They would allow you to press the button on when the rocket got dropped, and then they would record the rocket getting dropped, and then they would use that to effectively allow themselves to market more people purchasing more rockets. So you've got an entire supply chain for rocket purchasing that is independent of the state, which allows you to directly participate, whether you're on a tube in London or whether you're or whether you're close to the front lines. Of course, that's linked to point of view killing, where all of this snuff video stuff can be used for clickbait and for drawing in more marketing. It can show military effectiveness for those units that want to show that they're doing good work. And it can be used to amplify propaganda and online media and all the rest of it. And then ultimately, and maybe more horrifically, you can get involved in what might be described as crowd participation in target confirmation. So you can up like or down like who gets it or not. And there are examples of this happening online. Platforms themselves obviously move to try to limit and control that, but we also know that those platforms enforce their policies in entirely random, sometimes entirely random ways. But put that wrinkle in the story aside, what's happening on instant and encrypted social media is another matter entirely. And of course, then you've got to defend this participatory kill chain using which is obviously through something like the IT Army of Ukraine, again, a virtual community of cyber enthusiasts who might conduct remote cyber attacks. Or equally, you have the North Atlantic Fellows Organization who are trying to patrol online to ensure that only good news stories or appropriate news is reflected online around what's going on in Ukraine. Underlying all of this is the fact that military communications infrastructure is much more sophisticated than military communications infrastructure. So it's almost structurally the case, it seems to me, that civilians can communicate more quickly than the armed forces. That's not to say the armed forces can't switch things on or off or try to shape the media environment, and they obviously do with a view to try when they're thinking through their campaigns. But at root, we can go down into a local phone shop and buy a bit of technology that is much quicker than the armed forces can, who will invariably take 2 to 5 years to figure out what their requirements are and then buy a piece of kit, and by that time it's clearly and obviously out of date. So the suggestion that Gregory and I have been putting is that we've got kill chains as we understand them, but we're increasingly moving to a participatory kill web, an open kill web. A kill web for the Americans, is where you link all these sensors and shooters in such a way as you create more resilient kill chains. If one of the sensors goes down, there's another one available, and then that can produce a potential bit of data that can be used for targeting. The suggestion out of the framing in terms of participative warfare is that we are also part of that web, right? And we can also play a role in how military targeting works. So that's a bit of work that Gregory and I have taken forwards out of War in the Smartphone Age. It's stuff that I think it's fair to say he's also been thinking about as well. And so it was a real pleasure to work with him on that. Let me just move on. So, okay, so War in the Smartphone Age is really an attempt on my part to try and tell a history of the present. How do we get to where we are? Because these technologies are mundane and because we haven't really documented how things are going, and because it's complex, we need to sort of reflect, and because people are talking about how AI is going to revolutionize everything, we need to remember that the technologies that make AI possible are the same technologies that make our smartphone work properly. And so there's a sort of interlinkage here that we need to engage with. And we're getting so sidetracked by what AI may or may not be able to achieve. We're forgetting how we got to where we are right now. And I think this is especially important insofar as that big tech and is potentially reshaping and refashioning not only how we live, but how we engage with our governments. And so we kind of need to think a little bit about this because, and we need to have a baseline as to where we currently are, because otherwise we're going to get sidetracked by what AI will do without reflecting on how we've got to where we are. And I don't know when AI or will not fundamentally reshape the world as the big tech enthusiasts are telling us. But between then and now, I think we do have this moment which is a bit more participatory in nature, which is, relies on these mundane technologies that we take for granted that shape our experience, but also shape how we understand, represent, and conduct war. I think the important thing here is that, from my point of view, and the point I try to make in War and Smartphone Age, is that this is not just about how representations of war are shaped by these technologies, but also how the conduct of war is being shaped by these technologies. And that strikes me as being an important thing that the armed forces themselves have not properly grasped. So my sense is really that short of Section 230 of the US Communications Act being reformed to make social media platforms publishers rather than just places where just platforms for sharing information at the moment we are the publisher, so we are the ones that can be prosecuted for libel. But if the social media platforms themselves become publishers, then they themselves can be libeled, right? They themselves can be held to account for that libel. Now, that would be the obvious way to constrain or reshape and make the platforms responsible for the material that gets posted online. But Section 230 in the US is unlikely to get reformed for all sorts of reasons. And so my argument really is that, and the technologies themselves are so useful in terms of selling us things, is helpful to keep us in our splintered realities, in our bubbles. And so my suggestion is that that's here to stay. The technologies that make participatory media possible in Ukraine, non-state actors can do that. These technologies civilian technologies are being used for military purposes, repurposed for military activities. The armed forces aren't geared up for it. We talk about the transparent battlefields. Militaries talk about the transparent battlefield, but we've got a whole series of additional meta problems in here, which I think we might get into conversation with over a conversation over the next half hour or so.
16:47.
Yeah, it's telling me what time it is. 16:47. There we go. So I'm under surveillance already. I think one of the things I've been interested in is trying to map what I've been calling, what Benjamin Bratton's and others are calling the stack. So if we're going to understand information flows, we need to understand the relationships between some of these layers of the stack, and how that then shapes what we come to know and understand when and under what circumstances. And the important thing, I think, is really that these infrastructures are not evenly distributed, and that itself can be useful both militarily and from amplifying particular political messages. So I'm just conscious of time. How long have I been going? I hope I've not been going more than. I'm looking at Miglė, hoping that I haven't resulted in loss of attention. I put a couple of reviews up there, and of course my effort to persuade people to buy the book, and I hope I've done enough to make you think that it's worthwhile. My Amazon author page. But there you go. That's me.
Thanks so much, Matthew. No, that was. Oh yeah. Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Miglė. I'll hand straight over to you if that's okay.
Sure.
For the response.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for the talk. It wasn't too long. It was very interesting, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to respond to this excellent talk, and also to the discussion about Matthew's book, War in the Smartphone Age, which I personally read with great pleasure. And actually, excerpts from the book were also read by my students from the disciplines of social and cultural studies, who also found the book engaging. So it's very interesting and also accessible book. I found Matthew's research interesting, not only because my own research focuses on propaganda, participation, resistance, media witnessing, and war, but also because Matthew addresses and analyzes his key developments in many of these areas in a way that is, I think, as I mentioned, accessible to both academic and non-academic audiences without sort of oversimplifying the subject. So in the talk today, Matthew described his long-standing interests in the relationship between war and media technologies. And I think that this long-term research allows him, like Matthew wrote already a couple of books on the subject, 3 books, right? I think allows to grasp the breadth and also the depth of also the contemporary developments. And especially interesting in Matthew's talk today, I think is the main point that representation becomes agentic or operational, to put it in terms of filmmaker Harun Farocki, operational media, but also participatory and shapes the conduct of war. And also this, I find it very interesting, this aspect of crowdfunding, the sort of open and transparently documented kill chain practices, because I think it raises also the question, where is the state or where is the support from other states for the state that is attacked, and why is there a need to crowdfund at all? And Matthew's talk builds upon the new book published this summer. And I would like to also briefly respond to only a few of its key ideas, because I think there are many more. And I think you all should really read the book if you have not done so yet. And just very briefly, Matthew already addressed many of the aspects, so maybe something will be a bit repetitive, but I hope there will be some twists, some new twists I'll bring in here. So the book consists of 3 core parts, and the first part of the book examines the challenges of interpreting what we see on our smartphones. Basically, it's challenging nowadays. Part 2 discusses investigative and intelligence-focused research, as Matthew already discussed, also known as OSINT, but also OSINF, and their limitations, as well as the contemporary technology usage in military kill chain practices. And the part 3 focuses on contemporary forms of participatory and accelerating warfare, in which digital network development, also this kind of edge computing, mesh networks, and also AI models play a role. And I would like to start with a comment on book's preface, in which Matthew talks about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he writes that he and the people in his environment were not surprised by the start of this full-scale invasion in 2022, as they had discussed its possibility beforehand. But in my circles, many were surprised by the outbreak of the full-scale invasion when I was personally in Ukraine in February 2022, and many people also in Ukraine were surprised by the full-scale invasion. And I assume that being part of the field of military and war studies, as Matthew is, and also contributing to it, as this talk and the books do, sort of prepares you for war and the possibility of it. And by contrast, this kind of civilian disciplines, such as media and communication studies that I come from, often do not know really what war is like. And however, we're slowly learning about it, unfortunately, due to ongoing wars. And I think that research like that conducted by Matthew helps us also to do so. So in his book and in his research more broadly, Matthew brings war studies into sort of an interdisciplinary discussion. I think in particular, he links media studies, political studies, and war studies. And through such perspectives, one can become less surprised and more prepared by thinking through the possibility of war, which unfortunately is so important, this kind of understanding, this preparedness is so important in contemporary times when living in Europe. And in the book, Matthew asks sort of the main, or one of the several main questions: what happens when society is digitally mobilized for war? And one important issue he addresses is that the concept of war tends to focus on skilled generals and humans rather than technology, even though technology today allows for more people to participate in war. And Matthew also discusses how such technologies as smartphones can be used as weapons, which basically means that smartphones help you to identify and kill targets. And he argues that we often today, as we heard in the talk, overlook the weaponry role of smartphones by seeing them as a sort of mundane, civilian, everyday technology. And this perspective reminds me of that of one of the leading media historians. I mean, he is not alive anymore, but very famous in the media theory, media history communities, Friedrich Kittler from Germany, who analyzed the role of technology in warfare and argued that technology, rather than humans, and kind of provocatively argued that technology, rather than humans, shaped societal and military developments. So, for example, in his text about technological developments during Second World War by the Nazis, by the Nazi Germany, and their subsequent transfer of technologies and research-based knowledge to the Soviets and the Americans after Nazis lost the war, Kittler discusses the way in which, to quote, self-guided weaponry of the Second World War did away with two fundamental concepts of modernity, causality and subjectivity, end of quote. And these developments, which began in cybernetic fantasies and practices in the middle of the 20th century, have led to the contemporary condition of sort of hyper anti-causality and chaos, or in Matthew's words, created splintered realities and the increased role of digital technological power in both military and civilian environments. So the focus on smartphones and digital infrastructure during war implies, as Matthew argues, that civilian media technologies are having an increasing influence on military technologies. And I think this is an interesting observation because it demonstrates that the ongoing dual use of media technologies that seem mundane in times of peace. And I would argue, and I think Matthew does that as well, that historically large-scale media technologies have always had dual usage. So a famous example of this is the development of computer networks and the internet, which emerged from military-funded research in the US. But similarly, also in the Soviet Union, computer networking technologies were linked to the academic-military complex, blurring the distinction between civilian and military use already then. And these technologies were also further developed in post-socialist times through private and public-private partnership, resulting in the internet and web that are now widely used by civilians and are considered democratic, peaceful civilian media technologies. However, Matthew's Ford's focus on their usage in warfare, such as the use of smartphones, I think illustrates well how developments in media technologies always carry this promise of dual use, and we simply tend to forget this and then act surprised. And then we can also get reminded, however, not necessarily digital media infrastructures, which we link to civilian as kind of everyday usage today, such as trains or street networks or electricity networks, or as we know in Germany know very well, the gas networks also imply war, because war, as we empirically can see also in Europe nowadays, is unfortunately an unjust part of life, and that media infrastructures that are shaping societies in times of peace can be always repurposed in times of war. So with this debate of the smartphone media repurposing, I think Matthew steps into the larger and longer history of dual usage of media technologies and provides an important contribution, sort of a contemporary update to these historical media infrastructural debates, but also brings insights from war studies, for example, analyzing how armies repurpose these technologies and how their wide access reshape what it means to be a soldier, a civilian today. I also find it interesting and convincing that Matthew questioned the sort of anti-intellectual stance of contemporary cultures, where everyone feels qualified to have an opinion on topics such as developments in warfare and sort of post about them online. However, I was a bit doubtful when I read what Matthew calls, to quote, military Orientalism in his book on page 16, if this term is a suitable term to describe in particular the critique of the Russian approach of war, which essentially says, this kind of critique of military Orientalism, that the Russians are poor leaders and cannot fight. And why I was a bit doubtful, because I think that many of these critiques of Russian militarism and their strategies came from the Central and Eastern European countries, which have long-term experience of Russian aggression and oppression due to the fact that Russia is a large country that can afford to oppress others. So I would not call such critiques only Orientalism, although I'm sure there is enough of that with regards to Central and Eastern European countries. What I also appreciate, what I appreciate and find very interesting is Matthew's assertion that civilians in the West have become detached from the realities of war. I'm not sure if that is still accurate for most people in the so-called Western part of Europe, given the visual pressure in the skies and seas and on smartphones in many parts of the European Union, in particular, and obviously Ukraine. However, perhaps people in the US are actually becoming more detached, taking into consideration the current actions of the US government, but also broader political debates from the US. This is why I think it's crucial to reflect not only on detachment, but also on the political, social, military effects of detachment from war. So not only in detachment as a practice, but also what kind of effects this detachment has. Although I also acknowledge that estrangement and detachment can also be important ways for some people to survive the war. And in the case of Russia's war in Ukraine, that is in my research practice the main focus, it seems and feels as if the war is coming closer to various places in Europe, with Europe becoming less, or people in Europe becoming less detached. But at the same time, this war seems to be coming further and further, or further detached perhaps from in the US. So the question would be kind of rhetorical, I guess, question. What will be the implications of these dynamics of detachment be in the future, and who will continue to suffer or begin to suffer more? And the last point I would like to address is the multi-layered digital infrastructure, also called the stack and analyzed by Matthew. So this multi-layered infrastructure consists of course of telecom infrastructure, of cables, satellites, computers, smartphone, software applications, the internet, the web, the apps, and so on. And it enables the development of sort of proactive network-based targeting to find, to fix, to finish insurgency with the help of data analysts and AI models. In other words, it's not only technology, but their stack has complex dual usage. And each of their layers shape civilian and military communication today. So I would also wonder, how can the stack be sufficiently protected today, as it is constantly attacked through multiple cyber and physical attacks? The role of private companies and the state is crucial here, because the private sector, also often supported by the states they emerge from, mainly develops, expands, and maintains the stack nowadays. And Matthew Ford describes how Starlink or Amazon Web Services helped Ukraine, for example, migrate crucial state data, such as the land registry, to secure servers, thereby sort of maintaining state integrity. And at the same time, such cooperation, especially between American big tech companies and the countries in Europe, create dependencies. And I would argue that large US tech companies may be becoming the sort of digital equivalent of Russian gas in the context of Europe. And I wonder what Matthew thinks about that, and how or whether should Europe become less dependent on the US in the current uncertain geopolitical climate. And beyond infrastructural dependency, there is, of course, the broader issue of democratic governance, which the book briefly addresses. And I would also like to ask Matthew, what democracies will, do you think, what democracies will be like in the future when tech companies, especially those in large countries such as the US, provide more and more infrastructural support in times of war and peace? Who will decide how and when to fight? An iconic example of this is Elon Musk deactivating Starlink for the Ukrainian military in 2022 during a counteroffensive. And in light of the rise of socioeconomic inequalities that sort of constrain participation in decision-making processes, and as some argue, the current state of big power or even sort of global oligarch diplomacy prevail, how will current democracies and the wars they are fighting be governed in the future? So there are many more aspects of the talk and the book that cannot be addressed in this very short response. But I think, to put it briefly, sort of to summarize, the participatory warfare that Matthew addresses encompasses many different aspects, both representational and kinetic, and essentially reconfigures the roles of civilians, citizens, soldiers, and people beyond the country at war. And in essence, it expands the concept of the frontline beyond the army. And for me, this can be well read together with the work of, for example, media scholar Tatiana Lockwood, who's here with us, who analyzes civilian practices during war, and also Svetlana Matvienko's work, who focuses on cyber war and terror environments. And terror environments investigate how terror, and this is a concept developed by Matvienko, investigate how terror created by war expands beyond the event itself to encompass environmental, elemental, spatial, and temporal dimensions. And similarly, participatory war, a concept that Matthew develops, means that the war leaves the front line and becomes part of our lives and our futures. And the future is currently very uncertain, at least in Europe. And the research and work by scholars such as Matthew Ford, I think, creates the conditions for us to become more prepared for its developments. And thank you very much, Matthew, for writing this book. And I guess we can come into some sort of discussion.
Great, thanks, Miglė. Yeah, Matthew, feel free to respond, and others, if you want to also kind of line up a question, then feel free to raise a hand or type it in the chat. But yeah, Matthew, please.
Miglė, thank you so much for all of those generous words. I am amazed. I'm very pleased that basically I could write something that got you thinking in all these very important and interesting and all these different ways. You know, I mean, some of the last questions that you raise around the relationship between the private and the state, the private sector and the state, it seems to me are enormous. And the dependencies that are being created by big tech, and the relationship the state has with the big tech, the armed forces have, and how it's refashioning relationships between individuals and their democracies, strike me as being, so that's there are whole books on themselves that need to be written about this, and all I think trying to do here is, at least in the first place, point out how some of the ways these technologies have come about are creating those dependencies that you've just alluded to, and that implies, I think, in my mind, some significant transfers of power from democratic states to big tech. So, for example, although I didn't talk about it now, I do have a chapter on what I called accelerated war. So what happens when war's fought at the speed of data, and what are the technologies that are in place to enable that, and how, and the fact of the matter, the truth of it is, of course, that the state itself can't do that. It relies on the private sector to do it for it. It relies on big tech to do it for it. But that, in effect, creates the conditions in which big tech shapes how command and decision making is made by the armed forces themselves. And so this sort of very much undermines, at its core, the notion, the Weberian notion of the state having legitimate control over the use of military power for a community or a geographical space, because you're effectively creating a dependency there, and that dependency is one in which big tech itself is shaping what the armed forces see, because they're the ones that are representing, pulling together different sensors and bits of information and intelligence sources, and then sort of presenting that to the armed forces. So, big tech shapes what you see, and therefore what you attack and what you target and what you understand and what you think about, and how you might go about organizing yourself for war. But if you don't keep up your subscription, if you don't maintain your war as a service, your software as a service subscription, then effectively they can switch it off. And that means that, the state then no longer has access to a bit of core functionality that it becomes dependent on. And in the process, effectively undermines its own, it undermines the very notion of a Weberian state. So, some of the technologies that were sort of those technologies that make situational awareness possible are the same technologies that we're using to power our smartphones. It's, they're drawing on data that we ourselves are producing. We are the hamster in the wheel, if you will, that makes it possible to generate the AI, to train the AIs in the first place. We are the ones that are providing the data that allows people in intelligence community to understand our patterns of life. Our smartphones effectively remain on the grid, and they can show, there's this fantastic chart that a company, Recorded Future, have produced, which showed on day one of the full-scale invasion how Ukrainians themselves picked up and left Kiev and went west, right? And they didn't need any more data than people just going on, their connections to the cell phone network, and Recorded Future could observe that, model it, and then represent it for everyone to see. So, that technical capacity is not something the state necessarily can easily get access to, and big tech can do that, and it creates all these dependencies, as you observe, indeed, in relation to Elon and his low Earth orbital satellites and all the other things. But you can, and one response to that has been some stuff that's been going on in Denmark, where there's a pilot in one Danish government department to get rid of all things to do with Microsoft. So, and the reason why they're getting rid of Microsoft use of Microsoft software is because Trump, effectively, if he wanted, could subpoena Microsoft and force Microsoft to give the Trump administration access to all of the Danish records that are held on Microsoft servers. Now you could say, well, Microsoft have an agreement with Denmark not to do that, but if you were Microsoft and you had to sell, you would sell to the American government, because you're going to make more money out of selling to the American government than you would out of the Danish government. And contracts aside, you're almost certainly going to break your contract. Now, in the context of Trump threatening Denmark over Greenland, this is kind of the interrelationships between big tech, structural power, and geopolitics is really rather remarkable. And my view is that the smartphone effectively is a window in on all of those things. This is a sort of, we're so connected to these things. Our lives are so online. We're effectively watching the aggregation of all this data by big tech is creating all sorts of dependencies and problems for states and how we maintain state power and democratic oversight and control. So, that is an immediate kind of broadening, if you will, maybe unhelpfully, I don't know, depending on where we want to go with the conversation. But that just sort of, it seems to me, shows some of these interdependencies that we need to reflect on when it comes to thinking about how power, geopolitics, and war are working in the context of these infrastructures and these organizations, companies, and all the rest of it.
Yeah. I think we have some questions in the chat, but maybe I'll raise the last question, like just leaning on what you've just said now. So do you think, to kind of squeeze the question again, or to put you on the spot. So for instance, you're now in Sweden. So do you think that regions like European Union or Europe should actually get sort of EU, big tech, or that cooperation with big tech from the US should be regulated more?
I think that you can see that. Europe has already got sort of its defences drawn up in the form of regulating AI. It regulates AI and it regulates data. It gives us data protection. What it doesn't have is industry, its own tech industry, so that for it to regulate. So it's great at regulation, but terrible at actually having the industries that it could regulate. It has to regulate other countries' technologies, and clearly those companies located elsewhere in the world are subject to the legal constraints of the country in hand. So Silicon Valley, if the US decided to regulate Silicon Valley, it could, but there's nothing that we could necessarily do in Europe about that, short of us building our own infrastructures and building our own tech companies, which some people are advocating. There's a group that's just established in the last 9 months focusing on building a Eurostack. And the Eurostack is How does Europe wean itself off American and tech infrastructure that's not necessarily European, so that it could not just, regulation has failed. American money can always buy off regulators. What we need is our own tech infrastructure that we can then actually just do primary legislation on and constrain, shape, and direct as we choose to do ourselves.
Great. Thanks. Thank you both. Yeah, we've got a few questions, a couple of questions in the chat. So firstly from Chris Andrews. Hi, Matthew, that was really fascinating. Thank you. I'm a musicologist. Can you tell us what attacking a trance festival looks like from a military and communicative perspective, please?
I think if you're Hamas, you're looking to achieve maximum political effect. And what better way than to attack a bunch of people who are having fun? The contrast between controlled use of force and the panic that is produced by that maximizes the horror and political impact in Israel and beyond. And I think that's, in my mind, why that whole exercise was so powerful, right? It was such a sophisticated attack. They really absolutely knew, in my mind, how to achieve maximum political outcome. And I think that implies that they really do understand the participatory nature of the media space and how that itself needs to be managed or shaped in the context of actual war fighting. And the fact that there's all this footage that comes out of it is testament to the truth that they were right. They have changed world politics. Right? There's no doubt in my mind. A group, a military organization that was stuck on a 2G network in Gaza because Israel had kept Gaza on a 2G telecoms grid. They kept them on a 2G telecoms grid because then they could keep Hamas under total and absolute surveillance, and the whole of Gazan life under total and absolute surveillance, which meant that they knew everything about everything, and yet Hamas could still organize in the open, in front of everyone, in front of the most advanced armed force in the world, and achieve this political effect. I think that strikes me as being properly amazing.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we've got a second question here from Noel Packard. Frank Donner's Age of Surveillance and his other books already made similar points as what are re-observed today regarding that the less we are aware of surveillance, the more it produces the desired effect of passive behavior. McClintock's American Connection books document use of wireless networks to spy on people in limited networks to help inform pacification programs that tested electronically informed neutralization of targeted enemies. These authors were documenting this activity before the commercial internet to do what today can be done with commercial internet. You say, quote, "We are forgetting how we got where we are," end quote. So why don't we study what Donner and McClintock and C. Simpson and many other authors wrote about Cold War era surveillance when it was not yet commercial and was still in the exclusive hands of private and military interests who were shaping the networks into what they have become? Could you comment?
Sure. I mean, I think the truth of it is that they are studied in many respects because people working on counterinsurgency and insurgency and irregular war are very interested in intelligence collection, understanding patterns of life, making sense of patterns of life with a view to identifying difference. And by understanding difference, the potential, these become indicators and warnings. This is ordinary intelligence work, as it were, nuts and bolts intelligence work. Understanding those things with a view to picking out the irregularities and then using that to isolate insurgents or attack insurgents. So I don't disagree with you. I think, those things are going on. Those things have gone on. There's entire programs of work to put that technology in place. And I am not, for the life of me, trying to say that what I'm describing in War on the Smartphone Age is revolutionary or a lot of people say, well, is this transform? Are you talking about a revolution? And I'm like, not really. I'm just picking out some trends that I can see in the context of digital life and how we are living, and relating that back to what we're seeing in terms of the conduct of war. And I think you're right to point out the way these things are part of an evolution of ideas rather than something that is necessarily new in and of its own terms.
Thanks, Matthew. Okay, so I got two hands up. I didn't actually catch who was first hand up, but maybe, we'll go to Bernadette, if you want to.
Thanks, Patrick. And Matthew, thank you very much for your presentation of your book. I've read many of your previous ones. I haven't yet read this one, but I'm looking forward to doing that. I was interested in the fact that you were presenting the smartphone as kind of a civilian overlap with military infrastructure. And having just read Vivian Jabry's book on World in Conflict, I wondered how you might respond to the point that she makes there, that tries to construe civilians, not just in terms of injury and victimhood, but also as a socio-political subjectivity involved in resistance, in articulating the political. And how do you think that the smartphone might also be part of this attempt of the people to survive war? She describes war as a lively place, a place of resistant thought and action, because essentially people have to continue living in it and during it, and finishes her book with these thoughts on a resistant ecology, and war as a constitutive force as well as a destructive one. And again, so I was interested in whether or not you'd given any thought to whether the smartphone could be construed in that way.
So it's a great question, because I have been thinking. So when I think about war studies and how people may conceptualize it, it's sort of a domain of the armed forces, a domain of the military, and I don't, it's a long-term, the history of war studies is also the history of war and society, and my approach to War in the Smartphone Age and Radical War is that actually we need to think about war in society rather than something that's conducted to society, right? So it's it's coming out of our societies, right? People still have agency, even in the context of highly militarized situations. And I make a reference. I've been working with anthropologists who focus on, and I've just made a ERC synergy grant application to do more of this, where we're interested in how these technologies enable people to they're being repurposed for the purposes of war, but also for the purposes of managing clan relationships, managing crowdsourcing and remittance payments and all these other bits and pieces in Somalia and the Sahel, right? So this is not just something that's done to people, but that people are actively choosing to repurpose these things. So, WhatsApp traditionally, for a long time, was built around 256 people in a user group, and that was a function of the chip layout. And one of my anthropologist friends was doing some field work in Somalia and observed that that number 256 was also shaping the number of people that could be in a particular WhatsApp group. And that was then in turn shaping how clan politics was working. And that was also shaping how people were, you'd have a soldier with a rifle, and then you'd have a smartphone soldier. That person would be following the guy with the rifle, live broadcasting over WhatsApp what was going on, because they wanted to show that the money that was being raised by the diaspora for the purposes of defending their particular community or engaging in a particular activity, that was all being used in a particular kind of way, right? And so, and I just I don't think for a moment that the WhatsApp designers are thinking how this technology is going to be repurposed, but they are effectively munitions workers, it seems to me. That's they are the ones that are making all of this stuff possible. And, at what point do they become targets themselves? So, the technology itself is mediating conflict. And in turn, that's reshaping how conflict is being fought. I think that's the kind of underlying point I'm trying to get at here. And in that respect, you can go through processes of resistance as much as you can active engagement. And people try to get off the grid or, get rid of their connected to technologies. They switch things off and all the other bits and pieces that allow them to assert their agency. But that just strikes me as being in the context of these technologies, the ubiquity of these technologies, really. And so, that's my immediate response to that way of thinking is that we've kind of moved, I guess, into, what is it, the fourth dimension? We're already, our lives are not analog and digital. We've moved beyond that. We are, there's a space where it the new normal is where it's, the digital is a permanent feature of life, really. I don't know whether that answers your question directly, but it's in my mind, it's shaping what's possible, and that itself, what's possible is reflecting the technologies. So it's hit for those people who can imagine this space, all sorts of new politics are possible, really.
I mean, if I may just very briefly reply to that. I mean, I think Jabri's point is similar to the one that was made at the end of your discussion there, that war can't be confined to this limited spatiotemporal horizon, and that it continues to produce these generative excesses that go well beyond what is considered by war studies to be the kind of event of war. That sort of embodied experience of being in conflict can also be constitutive beyond technology, or maybe with technology. So, I mean, I often interested in the way that artistic practices pick up and look at technology. This is not generally seen as being an area of interest to people who study war, and yet we learn so much about what happens during and after war through looking at and understanding. For instance, in my case, I'm looking at Ugandan cinema, which grows up in the aftermath of Idi Amin and the Bush War. And the way that generates new creative practices, which are, in a sense, sustained by war. And so I'm just wondering, what are the additional possibilities that the smartphone in these kind of contexts might produce, not in a simple form of resistance where there are sort of, rebels that resist, for instance, but resistance in the zone of war, where to simply exist, to simply create is already a way of kicking back. We know the incredible kind of creativity that comes out of smartphones, as well as the ability to be able to target and attack.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's reformulating experience and in ways that artists are very good at adding context and meaning to, and offering opportunities to reflect and think through. I mean, that seems self-evidently the case, and there's been. I'm thinking of Shona Illingworth and others that are doing, great things in that respect. So for sure, and I guess this is the sort of on the representational side of things where the connection to the sort of hard side of things. There's plenty of scope for more thinking and investigation, really.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Bernadette. Thanks, Matthew. So I think we've got a question in the chat and then two more hands up. So I think maybe we'll leave that as the limit, so we don't end up going for an incredibly long amount of time. But I want to thanks for your patience, Pete. If you want to go ahead with your question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Matthew. Looking forward to reading the book. I was really sort of struck listening to the discussion around the particular Al-Ahli hospital attack debate and the OSINT discussion, because that was right at the beginning of the war post October 7th attacks, and I think 2 years later, I can't imagine a similar kind of discussion online around the details of a specific attack in the way that kind of played out at the start of the war, given the scale of the destruction of civilian infrastructure. And, I don't think anyone can, reasonably argue anymore that war has been conducted by Israel, with any regard for civilian infrastructure, etc. And I think the debates between different, sides of this online have shifted away from that kind of detailed OSINT analysis of individual attacks, trajectories, all of that, to, a questioning of the wider narrative, right? Sort of like the discussion of like, oh, this is all fake news. This is Palestinians faking their suffering, and then those kind of things being debunked, etc. So I guess my question is, like, in the wake of the kind of the destruction of Gaza, like, what is the sort of the future of OSINT there? From the perspective that you come at it, looking at the smartphone.
I mean, I think that the underlying problem that anyone doing OSINT has is that there's an exponential growth in data. So you've got, it's just not possible to. You need some algorithmic intervention itself to make sense of the stuff that you're seeing, and some of that ends up being forensic. You have to do it at a forensic metadata level as much as the platforms and the source material will allow you to do that. And I think that complicates the capacity to do this kind of work. And I think that's going to get worse. And certainly in the context of deep fakes and AIs and, AI slop and all of this other stuff that is being produced. But your broader point that this is having an effect, the violence itself is having an effect in terms of getting people to switch off from the details and focus on the big picture. I think that's right. That sounds evidently the case. And of course, some of this OSINT stuff is shaping media practices. It's not some of it. It is shaping media practices itself in terms of what's getting recorded and under what circumstances and why. And I think that presents even more challenges from a perspective of those doing open source work, because you've really got to think through very carefully the context in which some of this stuff is being produced. Otherwise, you could easily end up misrepresenting a particular narrative or story. And that implies even more sophistication, I think, into analytical, analytical, methodological and research terms. Now, even if you did all of that, is that shaping any of the narrative or not? Oh, I give a class around this sort of stuff, and I have 20 students in my class, and then I find out there's an AI fish on TikTok that has 5 million viewers that's repeating the news. And I'm pretty confident that no amount of media literacy, as might be described in terms of OSINT technique, could in any way, shape or form compensate for the 5 million viewers who are watching TikTok videos. So, are we locked in a distorting prism of utter nonsense? I think the answer is most definitely yes. How that leaves us as academics and all the rest of it, I think, is the question that I kind of probably, like everyone here, struggling with and trying to make sense of. Other than just focusing on the churn and the dysphoria and the prism itself, seeing past it and through into what's going on, I think, that has to, that's why I've been doing this work with Jethro, Jethro, and some Miriam and the others who I've been working with, is because actually a good way of getting past that is probably to actually sit with people whilst they're using their media devices and in the context of war, really, and going, well, what is it that you're doing, and how do we get back to that root of what doing good research what that means? And it's not looking at war from this end of the lens through our digital devices, but at the other end of the lens, where people are putting stuff into their digital devices, and then thinking about what that does in terms of mapping and tracing and making sense of information flows and thinking through meanings and all the other bits and pieces that we're doing. But that strikes me as being potentially very interdisciplinary in nature, because it's more than maybe any one of us could do and requires lots of coordination between people working in teams. And I think that does have implications for us as academics, because I guess ultimately you do need someone who's going to do some informatics alongside some anthropologists, some media studies people, some people who understand how war works, and trying to stitch all of that together in the hope that we might get a picture that at least reflects some of the literatures that we're familiar with in our disciplinary fields that have emerged over the last, however long our disciplines have been around. So that's kind of at least how I've been thinking about taking it forwards, because otherwise I think we are definitely stuck, and I don't see that situation getting any easier or better unless we can get to some kind of base line in research. And if I think about it, how many people are actually doing that? There's not that many people doing this, right? And so if we're not doing that, then what are we reporting on? And that worries me a bit as well, because we're producing stuff, but it's not really getting at how people are experiencing and living and making sense of these things under digital conditions. And now I notice that, there's Tanya and others here who are doing that, right? So, that's the bit that reassures me, when I see folks like yourselves doing it, because I'm like, well, if you can do it, then maybe I can do it as well. It's kind of how I've been thinking about it.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Pete. I just to add as well. I mean, this is sort of I've been doing quite a bit of stuff around kind of the shift as well within the OSINT space into, I mean, what I've called kind of legal capture. So this idea of having to adapt OSINT methods essentially to make evidence admissible within kind of legal systems. But to your point, Pete, I think it introduces exactly those same questions again, where it's the temporal difference between the speed of the complete destruction of Gaza and the time in which it takes to get some sort of adjudication on that also is a huge issue for OSINT. Completely. This the temporal difference there, the temporal scales are so massively out of sync, and I think it's also and then even more kind of systemically the utter failure of kind of IHL or international criminal law in the face of what we're seeing as well. So it's this interesting kind of shift where OSINT's like, okay, there's a certain sector of people who are like, right, we need to try and kind of reposition OSINT so it's this it's really an arm of of the law. But that has such limits when those structures themselves are, largely ineffective. But maybe I'll reach out to you separately because I think it's a really great question. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. And I'm conscious that it's late in in Sweden. So maybe we'll take the question from Svetlana, and then perhaps if you wanted to reach out with a question from to Matthew, you could reach out via email if that's okay. But yes, Svetlana.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this very interesting talk. I haven't read the book yet, but when I was listening to you, I was thinking about this concept of mediatization of kind of war. But what you presented sounds like it goes beyond of this mediatization process. Have you thought about mediatization as a working concept, and do you see it's in your research beyond this concept? That's the first part of the question. And second, what you talk about, so the war in smartphones age, the war has this kind of meaning of event, but what you talk about is this militarization of the society and states. Doesn't you think it goes beyond this war as an event? And especially when you were talking about the societies inside the war. So I would like to hear this reflection. And the second question is more to your empirical things which you presented here, because it was mainly Ukrainian case, which I'm most interested because my own research. And I wonder if you have a book and you studied this, do you have Russian cases, how for Russian societies it has been organized and how Russian society have been like swollen by this militarization?
So the book really is reflecting on how, I guess, ordinary and normal, and that's open clearly, situated and specific to communities and countries and geographies and all sorts of other bits and pieces. But how we live our lives there, and then in digital spaces, but then under conditions of war. So, and then the question is whether how the state may or may not mobilize that and mobilize those engagements. The extent to which that happens is sort of organically or in a participatory sense, where the state hasn't been involved and then where the state is. And I think as the war, I'm not claiming to be an expert on the war, the full-scale invasion of the war in Ukraine, but my sense is that as the war's progressed, the state has got more and more firmly involved in managing digital experiences or trying to shape those, and citizens themselves have become more familiar with what it is that they should and shouldn't report. And there's a sort of question around what's fair game and what can be used in terms of intelligence by the Russians by publishing something on Telegram or whatever, and then what makes sense just to keep quiet and talk about in a WhatsApp community amongst your friends and immediate family, and that sort of, I think, probably just attests to how the war itself is reshaping lived experience. And I suppose my jumping off point really, and I've been thinking about this a little bit more recently, is, and I don't think, if I think about it, I don't think European Union states have thought about this, what it takes to actually digitally mobilize societies. So that point about there being a difference between war and peace is not an easy distinction to hold on to. And clearly war studies people talk about that in terms of hybrid war. But how that manifests in terms of everyday experiences online, well, you could say, well, this is about trying to shape the narrative and representation, and it's about amplifying false news and disinformation and all the other bits and pieces. But what if I think about Sweden, there's a concept of total defense, and total defense is a is the mobilization of society for the purposes of deterring, and should war come, making it harder for Russians to move across the country. But there is no, as far as I understand it, in the framework, the doctrinal framework around total defense, there is no meaningful, as yet, sense as to what it means to digitally mobilize society. And that strikes me as being really rather remarkable. I mean, 3 years into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, where we have watched Ukrainian citizens and government try to make sense of, I mean, someone like, Ben O'Loughlin and Andrew Hoskins would talk about arrest this digital space so that the state can sustain some control over it. That has been going on over the last 3 years, I guess, up to a point. Tanya and maybe Miglė and maybe yourself, Svetlana, you'll have a sense as to whether that is actually true in terms of people's lived experiences beyond what I can see. But, documenting and understanding that strikes me as being really important. Equally, I don't see anyone necessarily thinking about how war is mediated. There are swathes of Ukraine under occupation that are still digitally connected in some way, shape, or form, and how the digital mediates those experiences, and what is communicated under what circumstances. There are not that many people I can think of. I can think of one or two people who are sort of documenting or trying to make sense of that experience. That's a very difficult thing to document, I think, for all the obvious reasons associated with the potential for citizens to be targeted by Russians. But at the same time, there's so much insight about how the digital is mediating experience and war from being in those spaces that I think we need to spend a bit of time reflecting on that. And maybe the obvious example is to go, as you say, towards Russia and say, well, how are Russians living in these digital and media spaces? And that will help us sort of make sense of some of this. I mean, and you can see people self-censoring and being very careful about what it is that they're doing when it comes to being online, but it's also shaping perceptions and understanding. And one thing that really struck me amongst the open source intelligence people that I know is that one task that they've been doing is just going back through OK and vContact to watch families who are memorializing their dead kids. And, on the one hand, that's just memorializing dead kids because they're upset and, all of the things that you would expect from having a death in the family. But from an open source intelligence point of view, that's a counting point. That's an opportunity to count how many people have died. And so they're busy going around. I think the group, there's a Discord, there's a subsection of a Discord channel sort of counting, it's a sort of dead mothers group, right? This is the Dead Mothers project, which is really rather horrendous in so many ways, but provides all these potential insights on how many casualties the Russians are experiencing as a result of the war. And I guess that's just the new normal. We kind of need to be reflecting on how that is working and recognize that there's sort of multiple things that can emerge out of it, not least of which is you get this intelligence picture, which isn't the same as sort of exploring different people's lived experiences as they're sort of represented in vContact. I don't. It's not an ideal answer, maybe, but it's kind of how I've been trying to reflect on how our lives are, how our devices mediate how digital life is shaping and mediating our understanding of war.
Thanks. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Svetlana, for the question. So I think we'll wrap up at this point. We've got no more hands up at the moment. I know there was a couple of questions in the chat that we didn't get to, but perhaps if you wanted to reach out to Matthew separately, you can. But yeah, just to say, really huge thank you to Matthew and to Miglė for the talk today. Matthew and Miglė, if you could just hold on for a second, I just debrief, and then oh, and if you want to be added to the mailing list for events, you can feel free to send me an email, which you can surely find through my academic page. But thanks everybody, and yeah, speak to you soon.